Mm. Well, up until a few months ago, I was directing the Middle East Center here, so my day was full of meetings, fundraising meetings, management meetings, meetings with scholars about their research projects, and not very much of my own research. And a few months ago, I passed the directorship off to somebody else, and so now I'm just back to being a senior fellow, and I'm working on a new book. So now my day is much more relaxed. And I get up and I think about, okay, what is the part of my research that I'm focused on today? What do I need to read? Right now I'm reading a new book by Elliot Abrams about human rights in US foreign policy. Because I'm working on a book about US alliances with dictatorships. Mm-hmm. So I'm reading a lot about the role of human rights in foreign policy, and I'm reading a lot of history. What are some of the major drivers, both in the United States and in Israel, for this long-standing partnership? So historically, there are elements that come out of shared values to democratic states. There are elements that grew out of the Cold War geopolitics in the Middle East. And there are elements, I think, that relate to the commitment, especially at the beginning, of President Truman and his recognition of the State of Israel, the commitment to the idea of Jewish self-determination as a legitimate part of international politics. And so I think all of those things still hold true. But democratic states, in the way they interact, as their politics shift, their relationships with one another may shift as well, right? So, if England has a Labour government or if England has a Tory government, that affects the tone and sometimes the substance of US-UK relations. And the same thing is true in the US-Israel relationship. So I think the fundamentals are still basically the same in those kinds of alliance relationships, but some of the atmospherics especially, and some specific policies can change. When you think about the US-Israel relationship and how it affects the broader Middle East, one of the most important anchors there is the fact that the United States has simultaneously had very strong partnerships with major Arab states. And especially after the 1970s, when the US was able to shift Egypt out of the pro-Soviet camp in the Middle East into the pro-American camp and mediate the first Arab-Israeli peace treaty, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, the Camp David Accords. That kind of iced America's dominance of the regional order in the Middle East. Yeah. Those partnerships with Egypt and Israel and getting them to sign a peace treaty with one another. That had a bunch of important effects on the region and on the United States. It meant that there was never again a major interstate Arab-Israeli war. Yeah. There have been some significant conflicts and periods of violence, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and the first Intifada, which started out fairly nonviolent but became more violent over time, the second Intifada, several Gaza wars. But the idea of a major interstate conflict in the Middle East, which as we saw in 1973 when the US and Soviet Union had nuclear alerts, that can be very destabilizing, right? So that peace treaty was super important to stabilizing a regional order that benefited the United States and our major partners in the region. And kind of icing this coalition of regional partners that worked with us to maintain that regional order up until 2011 when the Arab Awakening happened. So Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia were really America's major partners. Mm-hmm. This is also after the Iranian Revolution and the loss of the Shah as a major American partner. So after 2011, that geopolitical structure changed a lot, right? Mm-hmm. The Soviet Union obviously had disappeared, and Russia had been a non-factor in the Middle East for a long time. After 2011, it started to become more of a factor in the region, and now with the Russian intervention in Syria beginning in 2015, we see significant Russian engagement in the region in a way we hadn't seen in a while. The rise of China and China's growing energy needs and its growing interest in selling consumer products in the region, and its growing interest in getting technology from Israel, which is a really innovative economy. All of those have brought China more into the Middle East. And then the Arab awakening, led to this sort of breakdown of this regional system of Arab states and to the breakdown of some individual states within that system. And so that kind of threw the geopolitics of the Middle East up into the air. So now we're playing kind of 52 card pickup in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And the United States is no longer the dominant external factor. Yeah, look, I think that, well, first of all, the United States has been on record in support of a two-state solution since George W. Bush's administration. He was the first American president to announce explicit support for Palestinian self-determination.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in many ways that is fully consistent with U.S. policy toward the Middle East over all these decades. I also think that as a very practical matter, Israel is a successful, stable, Jewish and democratic state. Mm-hmm. It's not going anywhere. Palestinian nationalism is real and is not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So I think that both of these national claims and these aspirations to self-determination are legitimate, and I believe that both can still be accommodated. Not to say that it's easy.
Yeah.
And I think that there are a lot of people who argue now that as a practical matter, it's getting harder and harder to negotiate an equitable solution because of changes on the ground, demographic and territorial changes. I don't think that window is totally closed. But I think that you see both in Palestinian society and in Israeli society increasing mistrust and fear of the other side, and increasing cynicism about the possibility of peaceful coexistence. And so those, to me, are the biggest obstacles. But I think when you're looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you have a Palestinian national movement, the PLO, which committed itself in 1993 to a nonviolent resolution of its conflict with Israel, and Israel recognized the PLO as the legitimate interlocutor for settling this conflict, right? But then you have this other movement, Palestinian National Movement, which is more informed by religious ideology, and which actively embraces violence as a means to achieve Palestinian self-determination and resolve the conflict with Israel through the destruction of Israel, and that's Hamas. So obviously that's a major challenge, right?
Yeah.
You could negotiate a deal with the PLO, but the PLO does not in fact have effective control over all Palestinians or all Palestinian territory at this point, because Hamas is ruling in Gaza. And so, how you create a negotiating structure that either marginalizes Hamas to the point where it can no longer spoil a negotiating process, or creates some kind of magnetic attraction that brings Hamas around to change its behavior and change its commitments and join that process. That's the challenge we face when we think about what does a new negotiating structure look like, and we don't really have a good answer yet. I mean, right now, as we sit here, Hamas and Fatah have been negotiating a new power sharing agreement, and the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister visited Gaza this week for the first time in a few years, and so maybe that's a pathway to start a new round of negotiations, a new structure where Hamas would be, if not sitting at the table, kind of saying, okay, we agree, with this process going forward. That would be new.
Yeah.
I think that from an American perspective, even though the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has not in itself produced a major regionally destabilizing event like a big Arab-Israeli war in many decades, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have negative effects for American interests.
Oh, yeah.
And it doesn't mean that it's not destabilizing, especially in a region where there are already these contending ideological and political forces that are so willing and eager to make use of this conflict for their own ends, right? So when you have Al-Qaeda and ISIS who want to make arguments about a holy struggle for Jerusalem, right? There's just nothing good for the United States about giving them more material to work with, right? In that ideological battle or propaganda battle. And so even though I think that given the broader regional disorder, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict may have been pushed down the priority list for a number of states in the region.
That's what was saying, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think that it's of marginal relevance. I still think it's quite significant. And I think, we've seen since the last Gaza war in 2014, we've seen twice now periods of extreme tension in and around Jerusalem that had effects not only in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, but in Jordan and in Egypt. And in this 24/7 news cycle and instant spreading of information and so on, it's very, very easy for something that happens in one part of the region to have major political effects in another part of the region. So I think we can't kind of rely on the idea that this is a narrower or containable kind of conflict. Well, I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's changed our posture in more subtle ways because, our naval presence in the Persian Gulf is largely the same. It's not like we've pulled back naval forces from the Gulf because we have a nuclear deal. We still feel an obligation to protect the free navigation in and out of the Gulf and the free flow of energy supplies from the Gulf to global markets, right? We do that for ourselves, but we do it for the global economy because our economy is tied to the global economy. So that hasn't really changed. I think some of the things that have changed are, what are some of the contingencies that the US military positions itself to be prepared for? So without a nuclear deal, we had to think about what if the president wants to undertake a preemptive strike to prevent Iran from gaining a certain nuclear weapons capability. And so we would have to think about, do we have forces in the right places? Do we have supplies in the right places? Planes in the right places? I think the other big change in our military positioning in the region in the last few years is this new commitment to the military fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And so what began with 50 special operators, and a few trainers in Iraq is now, probably getting pretty close to 10,000 US forces in Iraq and Syria, and a lot more support in theater for the anti-ISIS fight. And that's significant. Well, so here we get to one of the biggest questions in American foreign policy, one that I honestly never thought of as a question until this past year, when we have a very different kind of president in office with a very different view of America's role in the world. Before, Republican and Democratic presidents have maintained a consensus view of America's role in the world, that because we are such an overwhelming power, not only militarily, economically, in terms of our cultural influence, if you live in a small country halfway around the world, you feel America as a force in your life every day. It's on your TV, it's the fast food restaurants that you eat, it's the jeans that you buy, and it is the government that gives or withholds aid, bed nets so that you and your kids don't get malaria, or, it sells weapons to either your government or maybe an adversary government. It's a tremendous force in the lives of people all over the world. And I think it's hard for us sitting here to understand how that feels from the perspective of someone living in a smaller country. And what that means is that our role in the world matters tremendously to other people's sense of security or insecurity. And if you've been studying international relations, you know that a nation, when it feels insecure, is likely to act in ways that could actually provoke the insecurity of other states, right? And that's how we get into a security dilemma and escalatory behavior that can lead to wars. That happened to the ancient Greeks, and it happens today. And so America's willingness to play that role of a security guarantor in the Middle East, for example, to say, not only did we broker Israeli-Egyptian peace, but we will put our peacekeepers in the Sinai to monitor that agreement. And we will give military aid to Israel and to Egypt to help them both feel secure without having to go to war with one another. That was an American commitment that made that peace possible and sustained it. And now Israel and Egypt sustain that peace for their own reasons of national interest and with their own sense of strength and self-confidence. And so when the United States doesn't play that role, and there's a vacuum left behind, one of two things happens. Either some other major power with large capabilities tries to fill that vacuum in its own way, for its own reasons, like Russia in Syria, where the Russians said, actually, we think the best answer to this civil war is for Bashar Assad to kill as many people as he needs to stay in power, so we're going to help him do that. Okay, that produces massive refugee flows to Europe, but the Russians are okay with that because they don't really want Europe to be strong anyway. So they're filling that vacuum for their own reasons in their own way, not in ways that are in accordance with our interests. If another major power doesn't fill that vacuum, small states try to figure out how to solve their problems by themselves. And they often do that by engaging in behavior that may flow from insecurity, but ends up being aggressive and starts wars. And so I think that, yes, America's leadership role in the world is a disproportionate burden. But our power in the world is vastly disproportionate as well. And the gains we get from international security are much greater than the gains everybody else gets. And so it's worth it.